what he brings to the table.
And that's kind of, this journey that we've been on, because you've been trying to get me to move completely over, and I'm moving in that direction. But because, I'm 61 years old, I've been eating this way, and I've been eating pretty much a paleo-style diet for now years.
Oh, yeah.
I'm shifting over and trying to get more fat in my diet so that I can try to get more of the things that I keep converting to sugar out. So I get it. I probably won't be that 100% ketogenic person, but I'm going to be that 75% ketogenic person.
And that's exactly what Mark Sisson talks about.
That's great. Let's take a look at this.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to learn so much from you. Can you tell us your name and a little bit about your background?
I'm Mark Sisson. I'm a former endurance athlete turned researcher in the health and wellness field. I have a blog called Mark's Daily Apple, wherein I espouse a lifestyle based on an evolutionary principle. The basic goal of this blog and all of the books that I've written are to improve metabolic flexibility, and that is really the essence of what I teach people. It's basically how to become really good at burning fat and to become less reliant on glucose.
So you started as an athlete. How old were you when you began?
I was 12 when I began. I really, I started at a very early age with an eye toward, literally toward improving my health and my longevity, if you can believe that.
At 12 years old?
At 12 years old, I started thinking about what it would take to live longer. From those ages of 12, 13, 14, I read all the books I could get my hands on that had to do with health and longevity. I started running because Ken Cooper had written a book called Aerobics, which indicated that the more aerobic activity you did, the better it was for your heart, and the better your heart was, the longer you'd live. So I went down this path of pursuing longevity and performance, which morphed into my becoming a top endurance athlete through college and then after college, ultimately doing marathons and triathlons. And ironically, through this pursuit of performance and becoming a faster runner, I realized I was sacrificing the health and longevity that I had originally sought. That became kind of an ironic reason for me to quit racing so hard and to delve deeply into the research on how the body works and what it is about our genetic recipe that wants us to be strong, lean, fit, happy, healthy, and productive, but the ways in which we thwart that natural tendency with the lifestyle choices that we make. So the rest of my career, the last 35 years, has been devoted to finding these hidden genetic switches that we all have that we can use to manifest the healthy, strong, lean, fit body that will live a long time.
So when you started to notice that you were performing at this incredible rate, but you were breaking down on the inside, what were you noticing? What was going on?
So in order to put in the inordinate number of miles that it took to become a top endurance athlete, I had to find a way to fuel that activity. And the conventional wisdom of the day was to fuel with lots of carbohydrate, to take in lots of pasta and cereal and bread and even some sugary drinks. There were a lot of sports drinks that were coming on the market then. But the idea was that that your entire athletic performance was hinged on the access to carbohydrates, whether it was glycogen stored in the muscles or whether it was your exogenous feeding of carbohydrate during your training and your activities or your races. So through the years of taking in vast quantities of carbohydrate, I recognized that I was putting in a lot of miles, but I was starting to become inflamed throughout my body. I started to have arthritis in my feet, tendonitis in my hips. I had irritable bowel syndrome that dictated pretty much every move I made throughout the day. I had upper respiratory tract infections several times a year, lingering sinus infections. It was crazy that I was trying to be this picture of health. And on the outside, if you looked at me, and I was on the cover of Runner's World magazine 3 times, and I looked every bit the fit athlete, but on the inside, I really was falling apart. I really was destroying my health.
So as a biologist, you're in school, you're learning about these, Darwinian principles and you're understanding sort of our primal nature, right? Like primal is you. That's who Mark is, this primal individual. And so you're learning this in school, you're a biologist, and yet you're experiencing this intense aggravation of your body through this exercise. How do you bring it all together? Where does it go?
Well, it was an evolution in my own development. It was sort of a blind homage that I paid to the conventional wisdom that said you should be eating large quantities of carbohydrates. So even though my research was indicating that perhaps grains were antithetical to health, I'd read a lot about anti-nutrients in grains and the gluten in particular and the phytates, and made intellectual sense to me as a scientist. But as a person who was still trying to perform on a national and sometimes a world stage as an endurance athlete, I couldn't just stop eating those foods. So I was kind of caught up in this cognitive dissonance, if you will, which lasted a few years. And it really wasn't until I kind of reached the end of my rope as an endurance athlete and said, I literally have, my arthritis is so bad that I can't continue to train at the level that I need to. My gut is falling apart from the IBS that I was suffering from. Eventually, I developed arthritis in my hands and fingers.
Wow.
And I thought, this just isn't right. And I literally did a 30-day elimination experiment where I chose to not eat grains for 30 days. And it was a huge epiphany for me. Within 30 days, my IBS went away. The arthritis in my fingertips went away. Eventually, the osteoarthritis in my feet went away. Some of the lingering systemic inflammatory signs that I had subsided. I can almost tell you that I felt the best that I had felt since I'd been 14 years old. Huh. I mean, it sometimes brings tears to my eyes now to realize that I struggled that long, thinking that it was something else in me, thinking that it was my genetic predispositions, thinking that it was, my type A nature that was causing stress that manifested itself in some of these other issues. So to understand the power of the choices that we make when we eat certain types of food, that's really what incentivized me to start my blog, Mark's Daily Apple, to start writing books about this power that we have to flip on certain genes that allow us to build muscle or that allow us to burn fat, and turn off those genes that cause us to develop type 2 diabetes or to store excessive amounts of fat or to suppress the immune system. This incredible power that we have to manifest ourselves, to rebuild, renew, regenerate, recreate ourselves, literally minute by minute, day by day, simply based on the inputs that we give our genes, which in turn are based on the lifestyle choices that we make.
So you started your blog, when did you start it?
2006.
2006. And every day you're putting information out there. So it's just an incredible amount of quality information on these topics. It's unsatiable.
Thank you. And the irony there is that, or the joke there, I guess, is that, when I started my blog, I thought I'd write something every day for a year. Be Mark's Daily Apple. Yeah. And after a year, I will have written everything that I need to say in this realm of health and diet and fitness and exercise. Well, obviously, all that did was open doors to new questions and new paths of exploration. And so for 11 and a half years now, I and my team have written something every day, and it's different every day because there are all these nuances and all these shifts and all these questions that arise and all these rabbit holes that we start to go down once we look at one particular aspect of health, and then a couple of more questions come up. Well, what if I give up grains, what am I going to do about fiber? Because aren't grains the best source of fiber?
So answer the question.
Well, so that question arose. What about fiber?
Yeah.
Because there's been a resurgence of interest in the gut biome.
Yes.
And the fact that so much of our health depends on having a healthy gut bacteria. Well, if you don't feed the healthy bacteria in your gut what they need, the substrate, the food that they need to create the short-chain fatty acids that then go on to not only allow them to live, but feed the cells lining the gut and all of the information that these cells put out and all of the signals and transmissions they make. If you don't feed that healthy gut bacteria, your health will subside. So we go back and we looked at the question of, well, wait a minute, a lot of the marketing around grains had to do with an excellent source of fiber. What if you take away the grains? Well, it turns out nothing bad happens as long as you consume vegetables and maybe some starchy, tubers once in a while and some fruit once in a while. And if you do that in a way that mimics an ancestral pattern, that is, eat like a caveman, you're providing plenty of substrate for those healthy gut bacteria. But that wasn't really readily apparent when the first article that I wrote about grains said, well, here's why you shouldn't eat grains. And then somebody said, well, wait a minute, if I don't eat grains, what'll I do in its replacement? I mean, one of my favorite, comebacks to that is, well, how will I eat a sandwich?
Right.
Well, okay, what is it about a sandwich, that makes your life complete? There are other alternatives.
When you look at carbohydrates today and you think about the athlete performing, like if you were coaching the next triathlete, what would you indicate to be the best sort of consumption of carbs and proteins and fats? What would that look like?
Well, it would look a lot different from what it was
Yeah.
back in my day of both training and coaching, because I was a coach for a long time. My main sort of theme right now is developing robust metabolic flexibility. So I try to develop metabolic flexibility and metabolic efficiency. The flexibility means that you're able to extract energy from different substrates within your body. You can extract energy from fat if fat is present, whether that's from food on your plate or whether that's from fat stored on your belly, your butt, your thighs, whatever. It means that you can extract energy from the ketones that you make by having become fat adapted and keto adapted. So the liver makes ketones, which become a replacement for glucose. Metabolic flexibility means that you burn even carbohydrate, glucose, when it's available, much more efficiently, so you don't throw off the reactive oxygen species that you would if you were just good at burning sugars. So this metabolic flexibility comes into play in an ordinary person's life because you wind up going through the day burning lots and lots of stored body fat. You can go long periods of time without having to eat or without being hungry. But in an athlete, it becomes really interesting when you realize that you could do a certain amount of work deriving most of your energy from fat. Now, I would train an athlete now to become exceptional at burning fat, and in so doing, to become good at making ketones and then burning those ketones in the brain instead of glucose. In other words, obviate the need to take in extraneous feedings or exogenous feedings of glucose, which buys you, again, not only more work output, because so much of the work is being done by the fat, but also there's this theory that in endurance athletes that the brain is the central governor of what's going on. That the reason you bonk or that you hit the wall in a race isn't because your legs have run out of glycogen. It's because your brain, which is used to burning glucose, has run out of glucose. And the brain has run out of fuel. It's run out of the only fuel it knows how to deal with, which is glucose, if you're a sugar burner. And once that low blood sugar hits the brain, it's the brain that says, pull over to the side of the road, let's take a nap. It's the brain that says, time to drop out. It's the brain that says, let's drop the pace from 5 minutes a mile to 7 minutes a mile. If you can train yourself to be fat adapted and keto adapted, and if you can train, and you can literally build the metabolic machinery in the brain to access and burn ketones instead of requiring glucose, then this low blood glucose that happens during a race becomes a non-issue, because you're still providing ketones that enable the brain to say, hey, everything's fine. We don't need to pull over. We don't need to slow the pace down that much. Everything's cool. So this whole central governor theory of the brain takes on a whole new context, a whole new paradigm when you've become fat adapted and keto adapted.
And for an athlete, is it easier and faster to become fat adapted and keto adapted than it is for an average person?
No, to become fat adapted and keto adapted, a lot of this depends on how willing you are to go all in, what sort of background you have in terms of your own history of eating and training, what your goals are. Most people will find, particularly athletes, will find that they can get 80% of the benefits of being keto adapted within 3 weeks.
Within 3 weeks.
Now, it takes another 3 or 4 weeks to become another 10% adapted. So now you can get 90% of your sort of maximum possible shift in energy over 6 to 8 weeks. The next 10% takes probably in some athletes as much as a year. And that's the real kind of sticking point for a lot of athletes who aren't willing to sacrifice an entire season of maybe not performing quite as well as they did when they were a sugar burner to get to that point where they're going to be better than they were. And so that's a huge sacrifice to require of a lot of athletes.
So what does all in mean to you when you say, depending on the time to get all in? What does that really mean?
I think all in means that you are willing to spend days and days and days and weeks where you're consuming less than 50 grams of carbohydrates every day, that you're literally forcing your body to shift over to a different fueling system than it's used to. And again, when an athlete who's been used to burning lots of carbohydrate their entire lives, and this is most of the endurance athlete, I mean, it's 95, 98% of the endurance athletes, it's a big shift, it's a big insult to the body and the brain to say, you know what, we're not going to be getting any more glucose for a while. So we have to start building new metabolic machinery. We have to increase the number of mitochondria. We have to increase the efficiency of those mitochondria in terms of how they put fat through, how they extract energy from fat. Ultimately, it's to the benefit of the athlete to have a lot of mitochondria that are able to burn a lot of fat because, and this is part of the metabolic flexibility equation, when you become really good at burning fat, it doesn't mean that you sacrifice your ability to burn glucose. You still have this ability to burn glucose, but now you have the capacity to burn fat efficiently, and glucose, and ketones, and almost most importantly, you tend to now be disinclined to be burning protein as a fuel source. And that's one of the major issues that a lot of athletes have. When you're a sugar burner, when you are an athlete who's been carbohydrate dependent your entire life, and you start to go to the well, you start to dig deep, you start to go to that point where you're just about to hit the wall. Some of the things that happen within the body are the body's natural fight or flight syndrome kicking in. This would be, again, where the brain is telling us to run fast.
Right.
We don't have much sugar left, so we're going to have to enter this gluconeogenesis phase where we try to summon all of these different resources to make more glucose. And in the case of an athlete who's been so sugar dependent that that's the only source of fuel that they know, literally the brain sends a signal to the adrenal glands to create cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that then literally looks for opportunities throughout the body to tear down muscle tissue and send the amino acids that it gets from tearing down the muscle tissue to the liver so that the liver can convert it to glucose so that the glucose can be used to fuel the brain. That's not a good situation to be in, and yet that's ultimately what happens to a lot of endurance athletes who go to the well, as we say, who dig so deeply that they're forcing their body to tear down this muscle protein. Now, if you're an athlete, muscle is like, that's the thing that you're kind of counting on to retain and to make you more powerful and more efficient. So losing muscle through this emergency gluconeogenesis process is not a good thing. It's assumed by every endurance athlete up to now that it's sort of a natural state of being. It's why most endurance athletes have skinny arms and not a lot of muscle mass on them, because they're sacrificing that muscle tissue all the time in order to create this glucose to feed the brain. Now, if you shift over to becoming fat adapted, and you become really good at burning fat, and you build the metabolic machinery to burn fat, and you build the metabolic machinery to make ketones at a high rate and to burn those ketones at a high rate, several new kind of concepts enter the picture, one of which is that when you are in ketosis or when you're creating ketones are an epigenetic signaling device. They actually cause the genes to turn on or off. And so the presence of beta-hydroxybutyrate will, for instance, cause this upregulation of genes that spare protein. So normally when you would have had taken in any amount of protein in excess, the body will find a way to either store it as muscle, to kind of keep the amino acids within a certain, what we call an amino acid sink throughout the body, or deaminate them and you lose them in your urine. When you enter ketosis and you start making these ketones, there's a recognition by the body that we have to be very conservative about how we allocate these amino acids. So let's not deaminate them and pee them out.
Right.
Let's not burn them for fuel. Let's just save them for the building of proteins and perhaps the building of the repair of certain proteins, certain cells, shoring up of the immune system or things like that. It's a very a new sort of concept that's just entered this picture, the idea that by cutting carbs down so low that you can create this epigenetic signaling device that causes the body to spare protein, it's almost counterintuitive, because you think, if you're a bodybuilder, can I build or maintain muscle mass on a very low carb diet, on a keto diet?
Right.
And the answer is yes, you can, partly because of this protein sparing effect.
So with this muscle sparing activity that goes on, how does that relate to the amount of protein we need to be taking in, and also what's really going on with our muscles?
Great question. So this notion that we need a lot of protein to maintain muscle has been tossed out the window recently. So we don't really need that much protein. The fact that we can take in excessive amounts of protein has kind of been a nice side effect of a bodybuilder's diet who wants to consume, they want to consume 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 calories a day, and you sort of have to consume a lot of protein to get that. There's also that assumption that the more protein that I consume, the more muscle I can build. The reality is, first of all, that you don't need that much protein to build muscle. Most of muscle building occurs as a result of the work that you do, the challenge that you give your muscles in the gym, and then the amount of rest that you give them, and then ultimately it's how much testosterone you produced as a result of that workout, growth hormone, things like that. In that large complex equation, the amount of protein isn't that significant. Ultimately, if we look back at how we're designed from an evolutionary standpoint, we're designed to eat a lot of food. Our brains are wired to eat a lot of food. Now, luckily for us, when we eat a lot of food, we gain fat. We gain that, we store that excess energy as fat. I say luckily for us from an evolutionary concept, because today most people are still really good at storing fat. But if you go back thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, food wasn't available 3 times a day. Food was available once in a while, sometimes once and then not for 2 or 3 days. So this wiring that we have in our brains today that wants us to overeat because there may not be another meal for a while, we still have that wiring. We've become so adept at storing fat. Well, our ancestors were also adept at just taking that fat out of storage and using it for fuel the next day and the next day until the next source of food came along. So we have this factory setting at birth that allows us to be great at storing fat and to be great at burning fat. The problem is, shortly after birth, and based on access to foods that we have throughout our lives, we lose this ability to take fat out of storage and to burn it so easily. We become really dependent on regular feedings of carbohydrate every couple of hours.
So if we go back to our ancestors and you take into this consideration the metabolic flexibility that you're talking about, our ancestors, were they in a state of ketosis for long periods of time? I'm really curious about how the two play together.
Well, now we get into an entirely nuanced tangent about ketosis. Because ketosis, by definition, is the excess of ketones in the bloodstream. A lot of people today would look at ketosis as the end goal. I want to be in ketosis. I want to have a lot of ketones in my bloodstream. But the goal really is metabolic flexibility. The goal is to become really good at burning fat and to become so efficient that you don't need to eat a lot of food. So the idea that our ancestors might have been in ketosis is a little bit of a misnomer. They would have been making ketones, but they would have been so metabolically flexible that they would have only been making enough ketones to supply the brain with the fuel it needed to stay cognitive and aware and happy and upbeat and on focus for finding the next amount of fuel. A fat-adapted and keto-adapted individual today or 1,000,000 years ago is an individual whose muscles derive most of their energy from fat, who don't require a lot of glucose for those muscles until the energy expenditure requirements get way, way up there, like 90, 95, 97% of max capacity. Up until that point, most of the energy comes from stored fat. A fat-adapted and keto-adapted individual today The muscles don't even use that much in the way of ketones because the body has, by that point, if they've spent 6 weeks doing a keto reset, for instance, the body has become adapted, saying, muscles, we don't need ketones. We're so good at burning fat, we don't even need ketones. Save the ketones for the brain. Now, here's the interesting thing about the brain. The brain doesn't have this wild swing in energy demands throughout the day. Your muscles do. You know, if you say, well, I'm going to go run a 5K, you know, your muscles go from using, a couple of calories per hour to using 1,000 calories per hour. So it's a huge increase in the requirements. The brain doesn't have those wild swings. So the brain's energy requirements throughout the day are pretty steady. And with that in mind, and knowing that you've built the metabolic machinery within the brain to use ketones, and knowing that the liver can make up to 150 grams of ketones a day if called upon to do that, that's about 700 calories worth of energy. But then the liver goes, if the muscles aren't using the ketones because they're so good at burning fat, if the brain doesn't need big wild swings of energy, then I can make ketones just slowly and steadily throughout the day and not have this huge excess of ketones in my bloodstream or in my urine. And so people who are truly keto adapted, sometimes they're not even in what we would call ketosis because they're so metabolically efficient. They're so good at extracting energy from their stored body fat. They're so good at producing just the right amount of ketones that the brain needs, knowing that the brain doesn't have these wild swings in energy demands, that you've created this tremendously flexible and efficient organism that is you.
That's such an exciting thought for so many of us that get nervous about, well, do I have to do this for the rest of my life? You talk about this 6-week period, and that is the period of time really to gain that metabolic flexibility. Can you share a little bit more?
The reason I chose 6 weeks is because that's the point at which you're going to probably get 90% of the ultimate potential benefits.
Got it.
And for most people, 6 weeks is a very achievable goal. And so much can happen in that 6 weeks. You can upregulate the number of mitochondria. We call it mitochondrial biogenesis. You can increase the number of these power plants within the cells that actually burn the fat. You can start to derive some of the anti-inflammatory benefits, which come with the epigenetic upregulating and signaling that is available through this ketogenic way of eating. You can start to derive more energy for your brain from ketones. So the brain starts to understand that there doesn't have to be a lot of glucose in order for me, the brain, to have great cognition, to have access to the memories, and to have the production and capacity that I anticipate. One of the things I noticed from my 6 weeks of keto reset that I do once a year now is that I sleep better. And I suspect that one of the reasons for that is that the brain does a lot more work in less time using ketones instead of requiring glucose when I sleep.
It's remarkable. So you're feeling that level of focus, clarity, needing less sleep. You're burning fat for fuel, and you've got this flexibility. And if you look back at the mark of 12 years old and you were looking for longevity and you were looking for not probably just, right, a lifespan that would be longer, but truly this health span that can be longer, this is how you're getting there.
Absolutely. Now, we can always look back and say, well, if I'd known then what I know now.
Sure.
And in my case, a lot of what I know now, because I learned it the hard way, is more valuable to me.
Right, and to the rest of us, right? Like what you've been through, that experience as an endurance athlete, all of those experiences, those nuances, is what enables us to learn, okay, it's about the metabolic flexibility.
Yeah, and like going back to the caveman question about how does that metabolic flexibility manifest itself, you have a day where there's food and you tend to overeat, and then you have a day or two or three where you don't eat, but then you come across, say, a supply of berries or a supply of fruit.
Right.
Now, fruit is probably one of the quickest ways to not only restore glycogen in the body, but also the fructose, which is the sugar part of the fruit, becomes triglycerides, which is stored as fat. So fruit gets stored as fat. Now, from an evolutionary context, this is like, wow, this is so cool because I'm eating this sweet food. My brain is telling me to overeat it. I know that my body is storing the excess calories as fat. I know that I'll be able to use those excess calories. I'm basically carrying a fuel tank around with me. And by the way, I'm a million years ago, so I'm not thinking about the cover of Shape magazine or anything else. I'm just thinking about survival. So this metabolic flexibility says, when there's food available, I can extract energy from the food. I can store some of the excess calories as food. When there's food not available, I can take some of that stored energy that I put on my body in the form of body fat. I can use it as energy, as an energy source. And I can go about my life as if nothing were bad or nothing were out of whack. It's just part of a normal lifestyle to not eat for long periods of time, but to have access to all this energy that's been stored in glycogen, in the muscles, or in fat on my body, and not worry about losing muscle mass, because one of the effects of being this metabolically flexible beast is that I'm so good now at sparing protein. I'm not wasting protein, so it doesn't take that much protein. I can go long periods of time without eating and not lose much, if anything, in the way of muscle mass. Now, this translates to today when we talk about long periods of fasting.
Right.
You know, historically, at least in the United States, fasting has kind of been looked on as inadvisable for people because you lose so much muscle mass when you don't eat for 4 days, and it takes you a long time to get that muscle back. And we're also sort of faced with things like The Biggest Loser, where we see people who lose 100 pounds in some short period of time, largely because they've cut their calories way, way back, and then they've increased the amount of exercise that they expend to try and burn off more calories. And yes, they lose 100 pounds, but then they gain it back over time because they've kind of sabotaged the whole process. They've actually burned their muscle away. So there's this assumption that if you fast for long periods of time, you'll lose muscle, and that's a bad thing. And it is a bad thing to lose muscle. But if you're a sugar burner and you fast, that is what happens. But if you become fat and keto adapted, again, you enter this new space of now, when I choose not to eat for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, I have all the energy I need, because everybody's got a certain amount of stored energy in the form of body fat. I don't lose muscle mass because I've got that epigenetic signaling effect of the ketones that's going to spare the protein and not cut into my protein stores. Probably one of the greatest effects of this longer-term fast is autophagy. It's the body's direction to now start to fix damaged proteins, to consume damaged proteins and fats, to actually start consuming old senescent cells for energy and get rid of those damaged cells that would have been causing problems in the long term if they'd hung around too long. So fasting now becomes this amazing new anti-aging experience available to people who have become fat and keto adapted, not just once in a while, but on a semi-regular basis.
So when you're getting into this fat adapted, metabolic, flexible space, what are the things you make sure you don't do? I've got an idea of some of the things you do, so I'd love to just hear, okay, these are the things I make sure I don't do, and these are the things that really help.
Well, so I'm in a metabolically flexible space right now, and I call it the keto zone. So having done the work, having spent time deep in ketosis, and having built the metabolic machinery, having created the number of mitochondria that I have now, I can exist in a space where some days I have 40 grams of carbs, which is clearly a keto strategy, and some days I have 130 grams of carbs, and I can't tell the difference energy-wise or mood-wise between the two. That's almost the definition of metabolic flexibility. I'm at that point of the ancestral being who's like, some days I eat, some days I don't care, it doesn't make a difference, as long as I don't feel different.
Right.
And really, this is about how you feel, right? This isn't about measuring numbers on keto sticks or glucose monitors or things like that. This is really about how do you feel. And if you can get to that point of metabolic flexibility where you feel great on any given day, despite the fact that you might have a 50 or 60 gram swing either way in terms of carb intake, then who cares?
Right.
Right? So now what don't I do? I don't eat large hits of sugar. So I don't eat a whole giant piece of triple chocolate cake. I don't eat a whole bowl of ice cream. I know those things are going to put me, whether or not they put me out of ketosis, they're going to make me feel crappy for what's in them. They're going to make me feel crappy because they've got sugar and processed whatever in it. So that's a thing that I just don't ever do. Now, I'll have 3 bites of the cake. I'll have a piece of cheesecake. I have a taste of something here or there, and that's really, again, knowing where the limitations are for me personally. Other than that, as long as I keep my diet to fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, fowl, eggs, nuts, and seeds, all the things that I know my genetic recipe calls for, then I'm going to be fine. And I don't pay attention to caloric intake on a daily basis. I don't count my macros because I become so intuitively tuned into these choices on a meal-to-meal basis. I just don't have to think about it anymore. And that's kind of what I try to teach the people who read my books and who go to my website, is like, I want you to live your life, to experience it from a point of view of enjoying every possible moment, enjoying every possible bite, and doing so without any guilt or second thoughts or thinking, oh my goodness, what would Mark have said about this? Or
Right.
what does the book say about that?
How do you look at keto cycling for the individuals that want to do that? Because there are so many different ways to sort of engage this metabolic flexibility that you're speaking about.
I mean, I think that cyclic ketogenesis is a great strategy for people who are, have a particular goal that they want to achieve. A lot of athletes use a cyclic ketogenic training where they're in ketosis or they're deep keto for long periods of time, and then they might, in advance of a day of hard glycolytic work, top off their carbohydrate stores and pay no attention to it. I mean, think about, being 50 or 60 grams of carbs a day for a week or two, deriving most of your energy from your stored body fat, becoming really good at that metabolic efficiency that we talked about, that metabolic flexibility, being able to go at 92% of max capacity, deriving most of your energy from fat. And then one night, the night before an interval day or the night before a race, have 225 grams of carbohydrate in the form of a sweet potato. It's a perfectly legitimate strategy that's taking advantage of the metabolic flexibility. So the next day you enter that race or that workout, you're good at burning fat, you're great at burning fat, and you've topped off your glycogen stores, and you haven't decreased your ability to burn glycogen. It's still there. So now you have access to all these different fuel substrates during a race or during a workout that the carb-dependent athlete doesn't have access to. The carb-dependent athlete is still like, okay, how many grams of carbs an hour can I cram down my gullet at hour 5 or hour 6 of that triathlon, and not have it be regurgitated. When
someone's becoming fat adapted and they're going through a little bit of that fight or flight, can you speak a little bit more about that transition and the cortisol levels?
There are a lot of ways to do keto wrong, in my estimation. There are a number of ways to do keto right. And one of the things that happens to people who are maybe not having the best success or luck with it is that they go all in and they decide that, I read this book on ketosis and the ketogenic diet, and I'm going to switch from 400 grams of carbs a day to 25 grams of carbs a day. Well, that's an insult to the brain. The brain, which has been used to you feeding it glucose every 2.5 hours for the last 25 years, and now you're going to willingly withhold glucose from that brain, the brain is going to fight back. And the brain is going to get moody and hangry and get a headache. And so that's one of the issues that a lot of people who, for instance, did Atkins years ago would encounter that same sort of thing. We call it the keto flu or the low-carb flu. It just feels terrible. That happens to people who don't stair-step their way into keto. That's one of the reasons I wrote the Keto Reset Diet. It's really a kinder, gentler way to get to this point where you literally earn the right to go keto. So we take a 21-day stair-step approach to eliminating a lot of the offending foods, the sugars, the pies, the cakes, the candies, the desserts, the pastas, the breads, the cereals, and all those things that convert to glucose. We get rid of those. We eliminate the industrial seed oils, which can be highly inflammatory in a lot of cases. And in its place, we eat meat, fish, fowl, eggs, nuts, seeds, vegetables, a little bit of fruit, go figure, all these things that we should be eating. But you have to really work hard to get more than 120 grams of carbs a day if you eat that way. So now you've gone from 400 grams of carbs a day, which was basically orange juice, waffles or pancakes, a mid-morning bagel snack, a sandwich for lunch and maybe some chips, a bowl of pasta in the evening, and maybe a bowl of ice cream, and you're easily at 400 grams of carbs. So you've gone from that paradigm down to 120 grams, where the body goes, this is less than I'm used to, and I'm going to have to start burning more fat, but I can deal with this, and it's not going to wreak havoc in my brain. After you get to that point of 110, 120 grams of carbs a day, then it's easy to find 50 or 60 grams of carbs that you're not going to eat later on when you go full keto. But you have to kind of earn the right. So we have a test in our book and in our programs. The test is, how do you feel after 21 days of eliminating all these high sugar, high carb foods and still never going hungry, because that's really critical. How do you feel when you wake up in the morning? Can you go any period of time without eating breakfast? If you can, that's an indication that you're getting good at burning fat. Can you do a mid-morning workout and not have a pre-workout meal or a post-workout meal? If you can, then that's an indication that you're burning fat. How's your sleep? Are you sleeping well? Because if you're not sleeping well, you're producing cortisol. Cortisol then sort of derails this whole fat burning paradigm, because cortisol tends to want your body to store fat and tear apart muscle, remember, to make glucose. So how are you sleeping? So we have a lot of these different items that we have in this midterm exam, and if you get a 75 on the midterm exam, you earn the right to go keto for 6 weeks.
Mark, thank you so much for providing so many insights into how we can become fat adapted and metabolically flexible. It's a complete and total honor. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
What an incredible athlete. And he did all this on this, what did you call it,
This metabolic flexibility.
Metabolic flexibility. Wow.